Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom, and in today's video, we are joined once again from our returning guest, Dr. John Salza. John, how are you doing today?
Hi, Dom. Great to be with you. Doing well.
Awesome. As usual, could you give a brief introduction for any newcomers?
Certainly. I am a Catholic apologist, an author, and speaker. My work can be found at trueorfalsepope.com, and I'm also a lay Dominican of the Central Province for St. Albert the Great.
Wonderful. Thanks, John. All right. So in today's video, we're going to be addressing the topic of sacramental intention and the errors of the Society of St. Pius X when it comes to that topic. But as usual, people don't address our arguments in our previous videos and instead attack our character. So to quickly start things off here, would you like, John, to address the silly rumor about receiving a Masonic award?
Well, thanks, Dom, for the opportunity to clear the air. I received an award nearly 5 years ago from the Order of the Sons and Daughters of Italy.
Mhm.
Which is the largest and oldest organization for Italian Americans in the United States. It's not a Masonic association at all. It's dedicated to those members, who've succeeded in their professional careers, who promote Italian culture, which I do. I teach Italian, I speak Italian. I've had some success in my profession. And so I was honored to receive an award from them. I was also honored, along with Republican Governor Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker's wife, Tonette, who happens to be of Italian American descent too. So, I don't know how these silly rumors start, but
Yeah.
I'll tell my opponents to keep them coming, because I do get emails weekly, Dom, from those who have been favorable to the society, who are noticing that when it's only character assassination, that tells the story that they don't have any substantive rebuttals to the articles and arguments we've been presenting. So it is
Right.
what it is. Hopefully that clears things up.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, so if people out there want to do a service, the Society of St. Pius X, address our arguments. If you want to do us a service, keep attacking our character, basically. All
Yeah,
right. That being said, okay, let's go ahead and dive in here, John, if that's okay with you. We're gonna look at the validity of a sacrament. What is required for a valid sacrament?
sure. The three components for a valid sacrament, Dom, are form, matter, and intention. And of course, if the sacrament requires the priesthood, then a validly ordained priest. But the form refers to the words that are recited in the sacred rite. The matter refers to that part of the sacrament with which something is done to confer grace. And then the intention simply means that the minister is doing what the church does. So form, matter, and intention. And the intention is internal, actually. And we know that the church does not judge internals, only externals. And so, what we mean by intention, what is external? It simply means that the minister intends to do what the church does. And that means simply performing the sacred action. Okay. So, the intent of the sacrament refers to the action, not the purpose of the sacrament, but the actual action that brings about the sacrament. As Bellarmine says, the action is simply performing the ceremony. It's the sacred action. And we can refer to the teaching of Pope Leo the 13th and Apostolicae Curae, where he says, quote, a person who has correctly and seriously used the requisite matter and form to effect and confer a sacrament is presumed for that very reason to have intended to do what the church does. On this principle rests the doctrine that a sacrament is truly conferred by the ministry of one who is a heretic or unbaptized, provided that the Catholic rite be employed. You see, that the rite be employed, the sacred action be employed, the ceremony takes place. So a heretic denies or doubts the faith. He doesn't simply have a lack of understanding of the sacrament, but one actually is one who opposes the teaching of the Catholic Church and rejects the doctrine. And yet, as Leo the 13th says, the Council of Trent says this clearly too, that baptism by heretics, for example, are valid because they do what the church does. So the point is that intention, although is interior and the church doesn't judge the internals, it judges simply whether the Catholic rite is employed. And if valid matter and form is used and the rite is employed, then the intention is presumed.
Understood. So in other words, the intention in this context is visible. It's intending to do what the church does, not intending to do what the church intends,
That's
right?
that's exactly right. The
Okay.
minister does not have to even believe in the sacramental effect. He can have a heretical understanding. In fact, as we're going to see and talk about, he can even explicitly reject the sacramental effects. So long as he's employing the Catholic rite and using valid matter and valid form, the intention is presumed to be there.
For example, like an atheist baptizing someone in the danger of death. Would that be correct?
That's right. I mean, we were taught as children, anybody can baptize in a necessity, a Muslim, a pagan, and so forth. They don't have to understand the sacramental effects. So it's not the intention of doing what the church intends. It's not intending the sacramental effect, but only doing what the church does, which is carrying out the sacred action.
Understood. Okay, so before we come to the society's errors in this area, so how did this teaching of sacramental intention come about? So why did it need to be addressed in the church?
This goes back quite a long way, and Salaveri actually addresses it in his theology manual. The question came up, Don, when, for example, a priest would be play acting, for
Hmm.
example, in a play and pretending he was saying mass. Or let's say
Mm,
he was having dinner and drinking a glass of wine and eating bread and came to the gospel passage and said, "This is my body." Or what if he was
mm,
teaching seminarians where there wasn't the intention to actually do the mass, but he's using valid matter and valid form? You see? So that's
yeah,
where it came out. The intention has to be to carry out the sacred action. And in those cases, he wouldn't be carrying out the sacred action. He would not be intending to do what the church does. And there are so many quotes I could give you. I'll give you one that's very helpful from Adrian Fortescue. He says the following. He says, quote, "People who are not theologians never seem to understand how little intention is wanted for a sacrament. The implicit intention of doing what Christ instituted means so small and vague a thing that one can hardly help having it unless one deliberately excludes it." So he goes on to say, "A man may have an utterly wrong heretical interpretation or a heretical and blasphemous view about a sacrament, and yet he confers it or receives it quite validly." So the point again, Dom, is that the minister does not have to understand the sacramental theology. He doesn't have to believe in the doctrine. In fact, he can even explicitly and publicly reject the doctrine. But if he's using valid matter and valid form and carrying out the sacred action, the intention is presumed to exist.
got it. Okay, so can you explain to us then precisely the error of Archbishop Lefebvre and the SSPX on this topic of sacramental intention?
It's a striking and most obvious error, and it should be evident to Catholics. Lefebvre held, contrary to what the church has always taught, Lefebvre held something completely different. He held that the minister had to believe in the underlying doctrine of the sacrament. So, for example,
Mhm.
if a priest was saying Mass, Lefebvre claimed that the priest actually had to believe in transubstantiation. If the priest was baptizing, Lefebvre would claim, and all of the society priests to this day, as we'll show, claim that he has to believe in the doctrine of original sin, that baptism washes away original sin. And then Lefebvre concluded that his belief in the doctrine ensures that he has the requisite intent. You see? So
Mm,
for Lefebvre, it depended upon the minister's personal faith in the sacrament, his understanding of the doctrine of the sacrament. Another way of thinking about Lefebvre's error is that Lefebvre and the SSPX maintain that the minister must intend the sacramental effect. Okay, not just carry out the sacred action, not just the action itself, but the purpose for which this Christ instituted the sacrament. He has to believe in it. And if he doesn't believe in the sacramental effects, say transubstantiation, then he would claim the sacrament is invalid or at least of dubious validity. And this is where Lefebvre and the society have totally butchered the church's theology. And it
mm.
started with Archbishop Lefebvre. It's carried on throughout the ages. Bishop Tissier, Father Launay, Father Scott, the current priests of this day in recent videos by Father Goldaddy and Father Sherry, they all promote this error. As Fortescue would say, these men are not theologians. And I want to prove this by giving you some quotes from Archbishop Lefebvre and others.
Okay.
And I will start with the open letter to confused Catholics, okay, by
Hmm.
Archbishop Lefebvre. This is what he says on page 48 and the top of page 49. Quote, are not priests who lose the faith in the same case? There are already priests who no longer wish to confect the sacrament of the Eucharist according to the Council of Trent's definition. No, they say the Council of Trent was a long time ago. Since then, we've had Vatican II. Now it's transsignification or transfinalization. Transubstantiation, the real presence of God under the appearances of bread and wine, not in these days. When a priest talks like this, listen carefully, he
Hmm.
makes no valid consecration. There is no mass or communion. That's according to Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. The priest has to have a personal faith in the doctrine of the Eucharist and of transubstantiation, or his sacrament's invalid. It's totally false. I'll quote you another one. This is from another society book,
Mm.
Most Asked Questions of the Society of St. Pius X, on page 28. Quote, the Novus Ordo Missae will no longer in and of itself guarantee that the celebrant has the intention. That will depend on his personal faith, generally unknown to those assisting, but more and more doubtful as the crisis in the church is prolonged. Therefore, these masses can be of doubtful validity and more so with time, end quote. That's on page 28. And it goes on and on and on. Another quote from Lefebvre back in 1977, February 2nd, a sermon in Econe. He says, quote, the radical and extensive changes made in the Roman rite of the holy sacrifice of the Mass and their resemblance to the modifications made by Luther oblige Catholics who remain loyal to their faith to question the validity of this new rite. End quote. Another one, 1986, Lefebvre, quote, but I think with priests who no longer have Catholic intentions, they don't know what the proper intention is, the intention of the church, so that the validity of their sacraments is at least doubtful. And I'll just give you another one by Father Linné. He says this, he said, quote, with the Mass, they think the Mass is just a meal. Remember, he's thinking of the doctrinal understanding of what the Mass is. They
Right.
think the Mass is just a meal. Then the intention becomes doubtful, and there is at least a doubt in many modern Masses because of their doctrinal misunderstanding. I'll give you one last quote. This is Father Sherry, who appeared on Michael Lofton's show a couple of years ago. He promoted this error repeatedly. Listen to exactly what Father Sherry says and says to this day. Now, in this video with Lofton, he says, quote, if you go to your local Novus Ordo priest and he says, I don't believe in transubstantiation, his mass is invalid, end quote.
Yeah.
No, Father Sherry's argument is invalid because the church teaches just the opposite. So I can go on, and these are only quotes on the Mass. But again, the society's error is that they believe the minister must have a faith in the doctrine underlying the sacrament, which then ensures he has the requisite intention. That is not at all what the church teaches.
There's a bit of an irony here because isn't it the complaint that there's a belief that it's the people or the subjects who come together and their faith makes the Eucharist present, as opposed to no, it's God's decree that makes the bread and wine become the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, even if we don't believe. So there's a kind
Yes.
of irony here where we're seeing again this kind of liberalism just showing up on the opposite spectrum, if that makes sense.
And that's done because Christ is the one conferring the sacrament. We
Yes.
can't forget that he's using the priest, but it's Christ who's actually conferring the sacrament and bringing about grace. And so, what Christ wills is simply that proper matter and form are used along with the sacred actions that the church prescribes, and then our
Mhm.
Lord takes care of the rest.
Yeah. It's almost like an extension of Donatism. Back then, it was the holiness of the priest. Now it's like his orthodoxy in a certain sense. But yeah. Anyway,
Yes, yes,
excellent. Okay, so you quoted Leo the 13th, and he's very clear.
yes.
Has the magisterium after Pope Leo the 13th addressed this very topic of sacramental intention?
Oh, yes, yes, it has. And I mentioned the Council of Trent also was very clear on this prior to Leo the 13th. We have a number of rulings on dubia submitted to the Holy Office, Dom. A couple of these come during the reign of Blessed Pius IX, and I want to read a couple of these because it's very
Okay.
important. And when you listen to these, you will see just how erroneous the society's position is. This will make it crystal clear to our viewers. In December 18th, 1872, the question from the Holy Office was whether baptism by heretics are doubtful due to a defect of intention, because the minister said the baptism had no effect on the soul, either immediately before the ceremony or even as taught in their individual sect. And what did the Holy Office say? No, in the negative, quote, because despite the error about the effects of baptism, the intention of doing what the church does is not excluded, end quote. So the Holy Office says explicitly here, even a denial of the sacramental effect does not invalidate the sacrament, even though the Society of St. Pius X teaches that if they deny the doctrine of the sacrament, such as transubstantiation, the sacrament is invalid.
Hmm.
Another ruling from the Holy Office a few years later in 1877, this addressed the baptism by a Methodist minister. And this was explained by Father Raphael he's a Benedictine in his dogmatic theology manual. And he says this, he says, baptisms of heretics are valid in spite of the fact that their ministers hold beliefs entirely incompatible with the Catholic doctrine concerning baptism and deny all power of regeneration in that sacrament. Okay, very important, very clear how in opposite the church's teaching is to the Society of St. Pius X. Listen to the second point that the Holy Office makes here. Quote, the peculiar errors which the ministers profess, either privately or publicly, do not at all affect baptism or any other sacrament. Any other sacrament. So what we're explaining today applies to all seven sacraments, not just the Mass, not just baptism, Holy Communion. The errors which the heretics profess privately or publicly are not incompatible with that intention which the ministers of the sacraments must have, namely, of doing what the church does. Those
Hmm.
errors in themselves cannot give rise to a general presumption against the validity of the sacraments, and in general, and in baptism in particular. And Dom, I can go on and on. This was repeated by the Holy Office under Pius XII in 1949. It was repeated again by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in 2001. It's been what the church has always taught. So the society's claim that a Novus Ordo minister's defective understanding or even rejection of the church's theology renders the sacrament doubtful or invalid based on a defect of intention is absolutely false. It's contrary to Catholic teaching. And this is so fundamental, Dom, that it is astonishing that the Society of St. Pius X has gotten away with this error for so long. I mean, we learned as children, I'm a cradle Catholic born and we learned this as children, that a pagan or a Muslim can validly baptize. You know, think about how obvious this error is. I mean, if the minister had to believe in the sacramental effect of baptism, how many baptisms throughout the centuries would be invalid?
Right. Yeah.
It's incredible. So it's a fundamental error. Unfortunately, it started with Lefebvre, and even to this day, it has permeated many aspects of the traditional movement, even with those that are within the church. Unfortunately.
Okay. So this error is so clearly obvious. Why in the world do you think Archbishop Lefebvre and the SSPX created this novel theology, this this nouvelle theology? Yeah.
Well, I mean, you said novel theology. Let me first address that, Dom. It is a
Yeah.
novel theology because remember, the Protestants they rejected the sacraments altogether, right? They may
Yeah.
have recognized a couple, but they rejected the sacramental system altogether. Now, the Sedevacantists they attack intention, but they primarily attack the form of the sacraments. Remember, the Sedevacantists, as you well know, often look to the modifications to the formal effective words of the new rites. But what
Hmm.
Lefebvre and the Society of St. Pius the Tenth are doing is they're creating a totally new, or as you said, novel theology, which doesn't attack the form, but it attacks primarily the intention. See, the
Mm.
society really can't argue against the form of the sacraments. They effectively acknowledge that at least the form is correct,
Yeah.
although some are even more radical than that. But to give them the benefit of the doubt, they'll say the form is correct. So they're now creating this attack on the intention and not the form. And what they do is they say, well, the form might be valid, but we have to look at the surrounding prayers. Okay.
Hmm.
And I'm not just talking about the liturgical abuses, which, by the way, don't invalidate the masses. That's actually, what makes them so problematic.
Yeah.
But the surrounding ceremonies. So the society look at the surrounding ceremonies and the prayers and the sermons and the gestures and the church architecture and the vestments and all these even extra liturgical elements, like how was this priest trained? What did he learn in the seminary? What books has he read? What articles has he written, etc. And all of that will lead them to conclude that the priest may not have the requisite intention.
Mm.
Okay. And again, the intention has nothing to do with the surroundings or the significatio adjunctis, as the theologians call it. I mean, again, if the society were true theologians, they would understand that the sacred action itself suffices for intention. The rest of it is not relevant to sacramental validity, which, by the way, makes things so problematic. This is why a black mass, for example, could be valid. Okay. So again,
Mm.
I say the proof of the surroundings, and I want to prove that. I want to quote from the society's website on their Q&A. It
Okay.
says this, it says, quote, since they, the sacraments, the new rites, do not express the intention of doing what the church does. Now, notice he's not talking about the form, but he's talking about the rite as a whole. The
Hmm.
intention of the priest cannot be explicitly known. And consequently, there is always a doubt as to the intention of the priest in the celebration of the new Mass and sacraments, which does not in any way exist in the traditional rite. The only way to have a moral certitude of valid sacraments is to assist at the traditional rite of Mass. End quote. That's from the Society, SSPX.org. Let me give you another quote again from Father Sherry in his infamous interview with Michael Lofton 2 years ago, where he repeats this same nonsense by saying, quote, the risk of invalidity is brought about by watering down of the faith and the clarity of expression of the faith, end quote.
Hmm.
This is why Father Sherry says that the society must, quote, check the ordination of priests, because one must be sure the bishop doing the ordination actually had the correct intention, end quote.
Wow.
Wrong, wrong, because the intention does not depend upon the surrounding circumstances or the bishop's sermon or the prayers or the vestments, so long as the priest intends to do what the church does, and that is perform a ceremony. But to answer your question, Don, you asked why has the society created this theology? Again, I'm
Yeah.
giving you my opinion on that. Well, I think number one, they do it to justify their willful separation from the Roman Catholic Church and the conciliar popes, who Lefebvre himself called antichrists. But I
Hmm.
would say more pointedly, I think the second reason would be that Lefebvre, he wanted to sow doubt among Novus Ordo Catholics about the validity of the sacraments that they were receiving so he could recruit them over to the society. I mean, that's, I think, what's going on here. Come to us. We can, you have a guarantee with us that your sacraments are valid. And this, again, is so insidious.
Hmm.
And it's so wrong. I mean, even to this day, I would say the society attempts to sow doubt even among the former Ecclesia Dei groups, Institute of
Hmm.
Christ the King, the Fraternity of St. Peter, not so much about the validity of the sacraments, but you know this too, Dom. They'll talk about the potential modernism in the sermons or the potential bad advice they might give, in the confessional.
Oh,
And
yeah.
even worse, if your local ICK oratory has a Novus Ordo Mass, you better ask the pastor whether Novus Ordo hosts are commingled with the host consecrated in the traditional Mass. Why? Because you might just be getting an unconsecrated host. And I've heard that
Insane.
too. And so have
Oh,
you.
I've heard it too. Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you know what? I even know ICK priests who do ensure that these hosts are not commingled. Why? Because the error of Archbishop Lefebvre has infected the entire traditionalist movement. And we've got to root this error out. We got to get rid of it, because even good priests with canonical mission have been influenced by these errors. And think about the damage this has caused.
Yeah. There's such a striking parallel here with the Donatists. They were putting, in doubt the sacraments of the larger church. For them, it's because of the holiness of the minister. But it
right?
just seems to me this kind of elitism here is also taking place. It's very interesting.
And the result is refusal of communion with those subject to the Roman pontiff, which is the definition of schism. This is a
Exactly.
completely heretical and schismatic position to maintain.
Yeah. Okay. So wait a minute here, though. So isn't there a contradiction here? Because what if a priest who says the traditional Latin Mass, the 1962 Missal,
Yeah.
has a doubt about transubstantiation? What then?
Dom, that's a great question. I mean, I've been studying all the problems that existed in the church before Vatican II. I mean, we know that the Holy See issued letters to a lot of the heads of the religious congregations to root out homosexuals and
Mhm.
those with, these same-sex attractions and heretics out of the seminaries. I mean, the society acts like there were no modernists in the church who may have doubted sacramental intention before Vatican II. I mean, that would be
Right.
news to St. Pius X, who said the modernists were already in the church during his reign, right?
Mhm.
But it does absolutely reveal a contradiction in their position because, on the one hand, they're going to claim that the traditional mass guarantees the intention, okay? But your point just proved that it can't, because what if you introduced or interviewed a traditional priest after he said the TLM? And what if he told you, I really don't believe in transubstantiation?
Yeah.
Then what? Well, then the society would presumably be forced to say, well, that mass was invalid because he didn't understand or he rejected the doctrinal, foundation of the Eucharist and did not intend the sacramental effect. And so that contradicts their thesis, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
that the TLM in that case didn't serve as the guardrails or the guarantee of sacramental validity. And so it really, it almost forces every Catholic to become this Inspector Clouseau, of what the priest actually believes, and we've got to investigate this. And this is the craziness now that has permeated the traditional movement. Now, the
Yeah.
church says if it's proper matter and form and the sacred action is performed, the sacrament is valid.
Okay. Let me throw another curveball at you though, because if doctrinal error doesn't invalidate a sacrament,
Yeah,
why are Mormon baptisms invalid? Since they use the same words, right?
that's a great question. And guess what? The CDF actually addressed that. I'm going to try to pull up some information on that. Dom, the answer is this, because the form of the Mormon baptism is invalid. Now, you might be asking, wait a minute, they baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. How can the form not be invalid? Well, because the church explained it that way. And I'll give you some information on that. The CDF addressed that question in 2001, and it
Mhm.
starts off with the theology that totally refutes the society's position by saying this. It says, quote, this explanation becomes even more necessary if one considers that errors of a doctrinal nature have never been considered sufficient to question the validity of the sacrament of baptism. Well, there you
Mm.
go. The CDF refutes in 2001 the society's position. But in this case, to be clear, Don, the CDF ruled that there was a defect in form. Why?
Mm.
Because in the Mormon baptism, there is no true invocation of the Trinity. All right. God the Father is this exalted man from
Oh,
another planet who has a
yeah.
wife, who has relatives, and the Son and the Holy Ghost, same things. It's bizarre. The Protestants are invoking the Blessed Trinity. And this is what the CDF actually says. This is their words. Quote, the words Father, Son, and Holy Spirit have for the Mormons a meaning totally different from the Christian meaning. The differences are so great that one cannot even consider that this doctrine is a heresy which emerged out of a false understanding of Christian doctrine. The teaching of the
Oh,
Mormons has a completely different matrix. End quote. So the church is saying, with regard to the Mormon baptism, it is a defect in form that
I
prevents the
see.
minister from having the proper intention. And
Yeah.
by their form, the Mormons intend to do not what the Catholic Church does, they intend to do what the Church of Mormon does. You see?
Mhm.
So the church says that the form expresses the intention. Bellarmine said that the form expresses the intention. If the form is defective, there will be no requisite intention. Now, in the society's case, they admit that the forms of the new rites are valid. So the Mormon baptism ruling doesn't apply to them because the society is attacking the
Oh,
Novus Ordo sacraments not based on form, but rather based on intention. And hence, that's the society's theology remains condemned.
fascinating. Okay, so okay, here's another question. If a minister uses valid matter and form, but interiorly withholds intent to do what the church does, what about then? Is the sacrament invalid?
Yes, we're not saying that intention is not required. We're explaining how the church judges whether the intention exists, you see?
I see.
And that judgment takes place only in the external form by confirming that the minister carried out the sacred action. That's the
I
only
see.
thing that can be judged on. Now, to
Mm,
answer your question, yes, if a minister positively intended interiorly to not do what the church does, that will render the sacrament invalid, but there's really no way of knowing about it. Okay.
mm,
Pope Alexander the Eighth in 1690 addressed this. He said, quote, a baptism is valid when conferred by a minister who observes every external rite and form of baptizing, but within his heart resolves to himself not to intend what the church does. He went on to say that the withholding of that intent would render the sacrament invalid. But the society is arguing that Novus Ordo sacraments are invalid or of dubious validity because of the minister's intention uh, uh, not to withhold, but rather that their theology is false. You see, and
yeah.
a doctrinal errors concerning the sacrament itself. And you know, it's ironic, Dom, when Lefebvre's own ordination to the priesthood was challenged because he was ordained by Cardinal Leonard, who you know was a Freemason, right? And his ordination was challenged. Well, then the society actually got sacramental theology correct. And they said, wait a minute, proper matter, proper form, sacred action. Even if he was ordained by a Freemason, Lefebvre's ordination's invalid. It came out with this, I think, around 1978 in the late 70s. It gives
Yeah.
you a proper explanation of sacramental intention, which again begs the question: why don't they apply their understanding of sacramental validity with regard to Lefebvre's ordination to the Novus Ordo sacraments? Why
I
is
see.
there a total difference? Again, it's completely disingenuous. When it comes to Novus Ordo priests, then they completely change their tune.
Yeah,
But
it's
Don, we
yeah.
should address this, and I don't know if you're going to ask it, but the society, um, this is not just to baptism and to
Yeah.
the mass. They actually hold this error with all the sacraments. I mean, I can give you some quotes on that too.
Yes, please, yeah.
Um, the Society of St. Pius the Tenth, they attack all the Novus Ordo sacraments. Okay, listen to what Archbishop Lefebvre says on October 28, 1988. He wrote this letter to Mr. Wilson. This was published by Avrier, and it's on their website. Lefebvre says, quote, I agree with your desire to reordain conditionally these priests, and I have done this reordination many times. All sacraments from the modernist bishops or priests are doubtful now. The changes are increasing, their intentions are no more Catholic. So Lefebvre
Wow.
himself said right there, right after he did his illicit consecrations, all the sacraments of the Novus Ordo are doubtful. Every one. We already talked about baptism. I'll refer you to one more quote there from Father Linné. Quote, and so you have the intention of the minister that becomes doubtful. If the minister in baptism, for instance, says, it's just a rite of initiation. If they reject the intention to remove original sin, then the intention is not proper because they are trained in the new way, then the intention is sometimes doubtful.
Mhm.
Now, that is the exact opposite of what the Holy Office just told us in 1872 and 1877.
Yeah.
Hasn't Father Linné read these rulings by the Holy Office? He says exactly the opposite of what the Holy Office has ruled. Confirmation, Dom. Here's I'm just again explaining they apply this to all the sacraments. Let's listen to what the society says about confirmation. This is Father Goldaddy, currently with the society, on a talk called Sacraments Number 11, concerns about the new rite of confirmation. Says that Lefebvre refers to, this is Father Goldaddy referring to Archbishop Lefebvre, who referred to an example that invalidates confirmation. There was a Monsignor Bouton. He wrote a book in which he said the confirmation does not give the Holy Ghost. And Father
Mhm.
Goldaddy is recounting this. And he only makes one aware, the sacrament of confirmation, that he had received the Holy Ghost in baptism, but he's not really receiving it in confirmation. This is the wrong intention. And thus, Father Goldaddy says, these confirmations are not valid. Okay, Father Goldaddy again is clearly wrong. One does not need to believe in the sacramental effect. He can even deny the sacramental effect, as this Monsignor Bouton did in the presence of Archbishop Lefebvre, since the form expresses the intention. It's funny in that interview, the questioner then asked Father Goldaddy, he asked this, he said, quote, Father, so if a bishop makes public statements, even outside the context of the celebration of the sacrament of confirmation, is this sufficient to doubt his intention? Father Goldaddy responds, exactly. End quote. Well,
Yeah.
Dom, it's exactly wrong, as we've just seen. Ordination, again, the society has been attacking Novus Ordo ordinations continually. Bishop Tissier says the same thing, 2016. He says we cannot accept the fake new rite of ordination that leaves doubts concerning the validity of numerous ordinations according to the new rite. This new rite of ordination is not Catholic. He's not just talking about the form, he's talking about the
The whole
rite
thing.
itself, the ceremony. And he makes that clear when he goes on to say, quote, this is Bishop Tissier, quote, due to the generalized disorder, both at the liturgical and dogmatic levels, we can have a serious reason to doubt the validity of certain Episcopal consecrations. There you
Wow.
go. I'll give you another one from Archbishop Lefebvre. Again, on the subject of Episcopal consecrations of a Bishop Daniels, who was the auxiliary bishop of Brussels. Lefebvre said the following, for public prayers, this is what was said and repeated by the crowd. Be an apostle like Peter and Paul. Be an apostle like the patron of this parish. Be an apostle like Gandhi, an apostle like Luther, an apostle like Martin Luther King. Be an apostle like Helda Camara. Be an apostle like Romero. Scandalous to be sure, right? An apostle like Luther. It is frightening, Archbishop Lefebvre says. It is, I agree with him. But was this bishop really consecrated, Archbishop Lefebvre asks? And he answers the question. We can doubt it anyway. Well, again, Dom, this is an overreaction to the crisis. Clearly, this is scandalous. But I don't know if you've had this experience. I have when I was attending the Society Chapel. Every single priest that we had that I
Mhm.
spoke with about this, they all said the same thing. And this happened over 15 years of me being there. They all
Mhm.
said that when somebody from the Novus Ordo would go to the society, they would have to investigate their ordination, even though they traced it to a legitimate bishop with canonical mission from the Pope. They would still question. And I said, "How do you guys do that?" And they said, "Well, we normally, if it happened a long time ago, we would get videotapes, the old VHS tapes, and we'd
Yeah.
watch the ordination." And we would see if the bishop may have said something, that maybe denied or at least doubted the sacrificial priesthood. And if we thought that was the case, then they concluded that he possibly didn't have the requisite intention to ordain. So think about this. The sacrament of ordination and episcopal consecration, conferring the fullness of the priesthood, they're focusing on a specific act that this priest is going to perform in the future, such as celebrating the Mass, the sacrificial priesthood. So it's almost like twice removed from the actual immediate effect of the ordination. And even that, the fact that they think based on a bad sermon, he might not
Yeah.
intend to make this man a priest, which then means he might not have the intention to offer sacrifice in the future. And because of that, down the road, well, the ordination is invalid, or at least of dubious validity, and we have to conditionally reordain. So what a scandal, and what an error, and what mess.
And also this kind of mindset, this kind of erroneous theology, practically speaking, what it does is it claims that the church is in the society because she's the one where there is no doubt, where all these sacraments are valid. Everywhere else is
Yeah,
dubious. Therefore, the society is the true church.
as
Yeah.
Lefebvre said, and Bishop Tissier, they have the four marks. Okay,
Yeah.
well, that's heretical. Okay, only the
Yeah.
Roman Catholic Church has the four marks. Certainly, A pious union that was suppressed in 1975 and has no canonical status whatsoever doesn't have any of the marks,
Yeah.
much less all four.
Yeah. Yeah, no, so I concur with you. I mean, growing up in the society, the doubtfulness of the validity of other masses was something constantly brought up. I mean, it was like drained into my skull, basically. But
Yes.
for the sake of the audience, I really find helpful the distinction between to intend what the church intends and to intend what the church does. So the former has to do with orthodoxy, doctrine. The latter has to do with, like you said, the external, which is what the church judges. Now, if someone intends not to do what the church does, that's when we can talk about a lack of intention that would possibly cause an invalid sacrament. So I think that distinction is
Yes.
really helpful.
No,
Is that
that's good.
correct?
That's good. No, that's right. And how do we
Okay.
judge that? Well, we know if proper matter and proper form are used. Okay.
Yeah.
And as the church says, the form is what expresses the intent. So
Hmm.
long as the priest is acting in the name of the church, for example, he's at an altar saying mass, he's carrying out the sacred functions, he then
Hmm.
has the requisite intention of doing what the church does.
Excellent.
It doesn't matter what he believes about the sacrament.
Right. No, that makes sense. Okay, so are there any other points at the at this juncture that you'd like to address before we move on?
Yeah, I think sometimes people bring up Apostolice Curae by Pope Leo XIII on the invalidity of Anglican orders.
Okay.
And some society apologists will raise this papal bull to argue that the Anglicans
Mm,
rejected the theology of the priesthood, and therefore they didn't have the proper intention, and therefore a rejection of the theology does in fact lead to an invalid sacrament, which is
I
what the
see.
society's position is.
Yeah.
That is wrong. Okay. Pope Leo XIII declared that the Anglican orders were invalid due to a defect in form, okay, which
Yeah.
then resulted in a defective intention. And this is what Leo the 13th says. He says, quote, the judgment of the pontiff applies universally to all Anglican ordinations because, although it refers to a particular case, it is not based upon any reason special to that case, but upon the defect of form, which defect equally affects all these ordinations. Leo goes on to say, quote, the signification still pertains chiefly to the form, since the matter is the part which is not determined by itself, but which is determined by the form. The matter is determined by the form. And Dom, what we see in this case is with the Anglican ordinations, the bishop was simply saying, receive the Holy Ghost.
I
He
see.
didn't mention priest or bishop. Okay.
Mm,
Now, this was added, almost more than a century later, which they added for the office and work of a priest. But as Leo XIII said, by then it was too late because they already had a different
yeah.
signification and meaning of those words. But
Yeah.
there was a defect in form because all the form said was receive the Holy Ghost. And so that form was ambiguous because we also receive the Holy Ghost in confirmation and extreme unction, for example.
Right.
So
Right.
Leo XIII there was saying that the defect in form then resulted secondarily in the defect in intention because the form expresses the intention. If there's a
Hmm.
defect in the form, then there will be a defect in intention. Remember, the society doesn't say there's a defect in form with the
Right.
Novus Ordo sacraments in general. They've
Mm,
created their own unique, novel, and erroneous theology, which isolates the intention based
yeah.
upon personal belief of the minister was a totally complete and erroneous novel theology. So when the apologists of the society will use Leo XIII, they're mixing apples and oranges. They already recognize the validity of the form, and in the Anglican case, the validity of the form was defective.
That's fascinating. It's very helpful. Okay, so before we take some questions from the chat, I just, I think we've covered everything when it comes to sacramental intention, why the society is wrong, and why she needs to, own up to this, and the faithful
Yeah.
need to be informed about this. Now, so do you have any closing thoughts or comments on everything we've covered today?
Well, I hope that any and every Catholic, Dom, should see the errors of the Society of St. Pius X on this. Again, we learned as Catholic school children anyone can baptize in a state of necessity. Okay, it doesn't matter. And of course, and we know if there needs to be the valid priesthood, that's required too. But the understanding of the sacramental effect is not relevant to intent. Okay, that's the first thing. And so I think, and I hope, Dom, that the ability to grasp these errors will be easier than maybe some of the material we've discussed in the past, right? Like on
Yeah.
supplied jurisdiction and
Yeah.
mission and episcopal consecration. So I think this is going to be much easier for Catholics to grasp. And the error is so obvious and so stark. And the priests of the society today have simply robotically repeated the errors of Archbishop Lefebvre. It's like, what did they learn in seminary with regard to sacramental theology? Because this stuff is so clear. So I hope that becomes clear to the Catholic. And I'm hoping that a society priest will actually admit that Lefebvre was wrong on this and they were all misled.
Hmm.
But I think because of its cult-like nature, I'm guessing that's not going to happen. But
Yeah. Yeah.
let's hope this produces some fruit, because it is a profound error that you and I both know still affects the traditionalists.
Awesome. Okay. Well, John, we have quite a few questions in the chat. If you have to go at any point, just let me know.
Sure.
We'll see how many we can cover. Starting with Josh here. He asks, is it at all possible that SSPX confessions prior to them receiving the faculties were illicit rather than flat out invalid? So we did address this somewhat, but maybe just as a refresher, what would you say to this, John?
Yeah, no, that's not possible, because the bishops of the society do not have ordinary jurisdiction, and the priests of the society are not incarnated and hence did not have the faculty to hear confessions before Francis granted them the faculty. So they were
Yeah.
clearly invalid. And the church only supplies jurisdiction to a minister who doesn't ordinarily have the faculty in the case where a Catholic community, not the society chapel, but a Catholic community would believe that the priest had the habitual faculty from the bishop. And
Yeah.
of course, no one who was going to society chapels believed that their bishop, their local ordinary, sent a society priest and gave him the habitual faculty. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, yeah, Josh. Unlike baptism, when it comes to confession and marriage, by the way, the validity does depend upon jurisdiction. Baptism is a different case, and the Eucharist as well.
Right.
So, excellent. Colin here, basically, as we were talking, kind of confirms what we were saying, which is that most sedevacantists I've spoken with on the subject of the intention confuse intention to do what the church intends with what the church does. Educated Novus Ordo Catholics also get this incorrect. That's true. Sometimes I've seen people get that incorrect as well. Um,
Very
so
true.
that wasn't really a question, but it was a great observation.
Yeah, good point,
Um,
Colin. Absolutely right.
um, this might be helpful. Khan asks, "I'm not leaving the Church of Rome, but why all the hate for the Latin rites? Do we hate the Latin rite, John?"
I love the Latin Rite. It's what I attend. I attend the traditional mass.
Yes.
So no, that's
That's
not
not
a
right.
correct
Yeah, I
statement.
love the 1962 missal
Yeah.
very much, very deeply. So yes. Okay, here's a question. Colin asks, uh, "Oh, this is not a question. Sorry, just a second. Thanks, Colin. Appreciate it." Colin says he
Yeah,
did
send
a
that to the
deep.
society priests, Colin.
Yeah, the
I've
list.
read them.
Yeah, list of books. Thanks, Colin. Yeah, Colin says here he did a deep dive in this topic. Great. Um. Okay. Scrolling down here. Okay, we have a question. Hi, John. Does the SSPX have any qualified and credentialed theologians, or are they simply priests who study theology?
They're priests who study Lefebvrean theology. That's what
I
I think. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm not a theologian. I'm an apologist who spent many, many years studying theology, even in the seminary. They gave me a key to the seminary, and I spent many, many years there. Fortunately, in seminary library. So, but no, I mean, I think the way the church has defined a theologian is he's got to teach with the qualifications from the Holy See in Rome, maybe at the Gregorian,
yeah,
something like that. But
yeah, yeah,
no, I really think that the question is, what are they learning in the seminary? Because this stuff is all out there. I fear that these seminarians are formed with the society propaganda, and they really they all defer to Archbishop Lefebvre. Father Sherry did, Father Goldaddy did in these recent videos on sacramental intention. They
Yeah.
ultimately refer to Lefebvre. They don't
Yeah.
refer to the Council of Trent or the three rulings, the four rulings of the Holy Office in the CDF. They don't refer to any of that. They refer to Lefebvre. So, again, my answer would be they're studying Lefebvrean theology, not the theology of the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I mean, they do teach a lot of good and orthodox things, but as we've seen today, they also teach error, and I like to sometimes call it post schismatic stress theology because they have to come up with an answer for their situation, which is
Yeah.
kind of a cognitive dissonance. So excellent. Rover asks, you stated on Reasoning Theology that the religious groups, such as the Benedictines, are phony. Does that mean that they are invalid orders, or are they valid but illicit? Thank you.
But it depends what you mean by orders. I mean, if somebody is validly ordained, they have holy orders. The question is whether they can lawfully exercise them, and the answer is no, unless they've been sent by a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction. If you're referring to whether they're proper religious under, for example, the Dominicans or Benedictines, not without ecclesiastical authority. I mentioned my own personal situation where, the society. When I was pursuing my Dominican vocation, actually, made a profession,
Oh,
for a society priest, and it came to learn that he wasn't authorized, even though I looked at the paperwork and everything seemed proper. I called the superior in Rome, and they had no record of it. So no, to be a proper religious order, that you have to be founded by ecclesiastical authority and maintained through that authority.
yeah. Rover, you might be, I'm not exactly sure, but you might be confusing the sacrament of holy orders and a religious order. Those would be two different things.
Yes.
Um, De Crevi asks a question: do you think the SSPX has fallen into Gnosticism?
Yeah, I think many in the trad movement have, because they all claim that they have this specialized, even secret Gnostic knowledge of the truth of things that nobody else really understands. And this is an example of that, where
Yeah.
if aren't you aware that if the minister really doesn't believe in transubstantiation, that mass is of dubious validity? Wow, I
Mhm.
never heard that before. No, but we got this from Archbishop Lefebvre, and he revealed this through his study, and this has been passed down through the society. No, this is really serious. You got to stay away from the Novus Ordo, make sure hosts and traditional rites aren't commingle the whole bit. So yeah,
Yeah.
there you could describe it as such.
Yeah. Yeah. And Larry asks, perhaps you discussed this earlier. What about those who say the new mass is invalid because the words of consecration were changed from for many to for all, and the removal of the Mysterium Fidei?
Yeah, it's funny, the Mysterium Fidei, that hasn't been part of the consecratory formula in the East and in many of the early liturgies of the West. In fact,
Hmm.
this was one of the criticisms, I believe. And Dom, you and I are publishing Dom Gerard's study on this, where they mentioned that was an impermissible accretion, actually, that it now
Yeah.
exists in the 62 missals. So,
Hmm.
look at, do the study in Mysterium Fidei. That's could be argued as not as traditional as some of the other rites. But for many or for all, I've written about this a long, long time ago. There
Hmm.
are certain words that are considered, the formal effective words, which actually carry out the sacrament, and those which are not essential to the sacrament. And
Hmm.
St. Thomas and many theologians have said that the for many and for all multis or pro omnibus
Hmm.
were not the formal effective words for the consecration, so that would not have
Yeah.
invalidated. It's just that this is my body, this is my blood. Those are the formal effective words that bring about the sacrament. Yes, the Sedevacantist, though, used that argument as a way to attack it. And the society, frankly, has as well. I mean, I think
Hmm.
Father Linné, don't quote me on that, but I know a number of society priests says it was problematic. It was a
Hmm.
change and it raises some issues and so forth. But again, Holy
Yeah.
Mother Church, we defer to Holy Mother Church.
Yeah. And the church corrected that translation, and
That's
she
right.
returned to the more proper use. Yeah.
Thanks to St.
But again,
Pope Benedict, yes.
Yes, that's right. But again, not pertaining to the validity of the sacrament. Now, yeah, I'm looking forward to, maybe we could do a video sometime soon on the Don Gerard text, because that was really an eye opener for me. It was
Yeah,
really helpful, so that'll be great.
that'd be awesome.
Um, Okay, looks like we covered all the questions. Thanks for the presentation, Don. It's really, every time I have you on, I learn something more precisely when the video is over. So that's really helpful. Any last words you want to give to the audience?
I think this is really serious, Don. And I would say, I would ask, for example, Bishop Schneider, Archbishop Vigano, prominent churchmen. I would ask,
Hmm.
their excellencies, to come out on this and to point these errors out. Why is it lay people doing all this work? I mean, we need some help. Okay.
Hmm.
I'm hoping that this does catch a little bit of fire, but I would also ask, their excellencies and any bishop, who has made favorable statements to the society, and there aren't many, but there are a few. I mean, I would say, as I study this, are the new rites bastard rites? Are they bastard sacraments? Do you really believe that? For example,
Hmm.
Lefebvre said in 1976, you may have heard this quote, Don, you probably did,
Yes.
in Lille, France. He said, quote, "And who are those bastards?" This is Archbishop Lefebvre. "They are our rites. The rite of Mass is a bastard rite. The sacraments are bastard sacraments. We no longer know if they are sacraments which give grace or which do not give grace. We no longer know if this Mass gives the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ or if it does not give them." So, Bishop Schneider, Your Excellency, do you believe that the new rites are bastard rites? Archbishop Vigano, Your Excellency, do you believe that these are bastard sacraments? We need these great churchmen who know more than I do to come out and fight for Holy Mother Church and correct error. Yes, the society does many good things, and I think they have good intentions, but right now they're operating outside of Holy Mother Church, and they are a false solution to the problem in with the loss of faith. They're not part of the church. They haven't been sent by the church, but they're also teaching errors that are contrary to the Catholic faith. And frankly, the society has actually contributed to the loss of faith in the post Vatican II church, which is the very crisis that they lament because they have sown doubt and division among those within the church by claiming that the Novus Ordo sacraments are invalid or of dubious validity. This has to be corrected. This has to stop. We need to stand up for Holy Mother Church.
Completely agree. And as you said, sure, the society priests have good intentions, but this whole video is about the fact that that's just not enough. It's about the, the real structure of the church, the visible structure of the church. Good intentions is not what matters here. Okay, well, John, thank you so much. And audience, please like, subscribe, hit that notification bell. And if you enjoy our content here and it's helping you, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/the Logos Project. And so without further ado, we'll say goodbye. Thanks, John.